Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our third and final Ed Talk at this great EdPalooza event. I am so inspired by the speakers and your engagement around today's most important issues in education. Thank you for being part of our shared mission to transform education and for joining us at EdPalooza. While most of us are working to improve education here in the U.S., innovations that help students achieve success are happening all around the world. How do we know how American students measure up? And how do we know whether innovative solutions are making an impact, especially this year, as educators respond to the pandemic and to the unexpected disruption? The answer is captured by the work of today's EdTalk speaker, Andreas Schleicher. As Special Advisor on Education Policy and Director for Education and Skills, Andreas has spent more than 2 decades at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's where he oversees PISA, the Programming for International Student Assessment. PISA assessments results are worldwide indicators of students' capabilities. As you know, countries use this information to fine-tune their education policies and also to learn what's working far beyond their own borders. The perspective of an education expert working at a global level is invaluable. Before our Q&A session with Andreas, he's going to share insights on the impact of the global pandemic on student learning. We'll hear which countries are responding well to our rapidly changing world and why. And we'll talk about how the U.S. can learn from these examples to drive change, which can benefit students and school systems in our own communities and states. Andreas' research shows us how the best education systems continually look forward and outward to innovate and to collaborate as they strive towards excellence. His work demonstrates that policy can and really does make a difference. On behalf of all our EdPalooza attendees here in the U.S. and around the globe, I extend a warm welcome to Andreas Schleicher.
These are difficult times for education. 1.5 billion students around the world were locked out of their schools. You can say that children are the ones least vulnerable to the coronavirus. But I don't think anybody has been more affected by the public policy responses to this virus than children. The learning losses during school closures could eat up 3% of their lifetime earnings. They also throw long shadows over our future economic development. In the US, the economic drag from learning losses during the pandemic could mount to $15 trillion over the working life of the COVID generation of students. And different from the direct economic impact of the pandemic, which is temporary, those effects are permanent. But simply our schools today will be our economy tomorrow. Those of you who have children saw how remote learning became the lifeline for education. But huge differences in access, in use, in the quality of digital resources have greatly amplified inequality during the pandemic, and they put up a steep learning curve for teachers. One of the things students will take away from this experience is that learning is not a place. It's an activity. And that learning and technology must work better together in the future. I know there are some who believe students will somehow recover from those learning losses. But history suggests that's not easy. And it will certainly not happen if education returns to the status quo when things get back to normal. Think back for a moment to the world in the year 2000. When we started with PISA, the most rigorous and comprehensive effort to track learning outcomes across the world. In those days, students read carefully curated textbooks. And then when they had a question, they could look the answer up in an encyclopedia. And they could trust that answer to be true. Today, they will look for their answers on Google, and nobody will tell them what is right and what is wrong. Literacy is no longer just about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge, a very different skill set. It was in the early 2000s that technology began to change what we read and how we read. But the capacity of American 15-year-olds to understand, to use, evaluate, reflect on written information didn't really change. You see that here in the red line. 2006, when we did our third PISA assessment, that was the year before the iPhone was invented. Twitter was still a sound, the Amazon still a river. Around 2009, social media began to have a real impact on the nature of reading. In fact, we began to talk to our computers in those years. But again, educational outcomes kept flatlining. And then think how robotics, virtual reality, cloud computing, big data, artificial intelligence all began to mesh the real world and the digital world. But it's clear that learning outcomes in the US, and in fact in most parts of the industrialized world, did not keep up with those changes. If you would see a flat line like this on a brain scan, you would get very worried. The speed, the volume, the reach of information flows in this new digital ecosystem have created the perfect conditions for fake news to thrive, affecting public opinion and political choices. Contrast that with just 14% of 15-year-old Americans being able to distinguish between fact and opinion when the tasks require figuring out implicit cues to the content or the source of information in PISA. Precisely the things that everyone is now asked to do successfully. You can say this figure is 4 points up from where the US stood 20 years ago. But we live in a world that is not marginally changed, but totally changed. But then some education systems have figured this out. Look at the 4 provinces in China, Beijing, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and Zhejiang, that took part in PISA, and that moved up to the top of the scale. Or see how Singapore keeps advancing from good to great, or how Estonia has steadily moved to the top among OECD countries, despite the fact that its expenditure per student remains about 30% lower than the OECD average. Also, Portugal advanced to the OECD average levels despite being severely hit by the financial crisis. Or look at Poland. Some countries that still perform well below the OECD average also saw remarkable improvements in their performance. Look at Peru or Albania here. Brazil's or Turkey's improvement may look a bit less impressive, but between 2003 and 2018, Turkey was able to double the coverage of the 15-year-olds who are enrolled in school and covered by PISA. And that shows us that the quality of education doesn't have to be sacrificed when we increase access to schooling. For many years, Sweden used to be the most rapidly deteriorating school system. But then around 2010, they took courageous steps to fix that. And you can see how they caught the ball and got things back on track. And that shows how policy can make a difference. So that's how we get to the league table of education systems that you're so familiar with. And don't think that you can fix all of that easily with just more money. Money is necessary, but it's not sufficient to secure strong and equitable learning outcomes. At the spending level where you find the United States, it matters a lot more how you invest your resources than just on how much you invest. And what you can learn from PISA here is that whenever high-performing education systems have to make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they prioritize the quality of teachers and teaching. Nowhere does the quality of a school system exceed the quality of its teachers. Top school systems always select and educate their teaching staff carefully. And they provide an environment in which teachers work together to frame good practice. And they encourage their teachers to grow in their careers. The picture is quite similar when it comes to learning time. There are huge differences across countries in the time students spend learning. Both in school, you see that here marked in blue, and out of school, things like tutoring, homework, and so on. You can see that marked in yellow. Look at the UAE, where 15-year-olds spend close to 60 hours learning per week. And then you contrast that with Finland, where it's just a little more than half of that time. But when you look at productivity, you see that students in Finland or Germany or Switzerland learn a lot in very little time, while students in the UAE learn comparatively little in a lot of time. You know, learning outcomes are always the product of the quantity of time and the quality of learning environments. And we are much better off focusing on raising productivity than just doing more of the same. So how to move forward? When you look at world-class education systems, they have moved from just teaching students something towards providing them with a reliable compass and the tools to navigate with confidence through an increasingly uncertain, volatile, ambiguous world. They've moved from helping just some students to succeed to embracing how different students learn differently with differentiated pedagogical practice. The future is about building instruction from students' passions and capacities, helping students personalize their learning in ways that foster engagement, that foster talent. High-performing school systems do understand how different students learn differently. And they leverage the extraordinary talents of ordinary students. The challenge is that this requires a very different approach to learning and teaching and a different caliber of teachers. But teaching is about imparting prefabricated knowledge. Countries can afford low teacher quality. And when teacher quality is low, governments tend to tell their teachers exactly what to teach and exactly how they want it done, using a quite industrial organization of work to get the results they want. But the highest performing education systems have made teaching a profession of advanced knowledge workers who work with a high level of professional autonomy and yet within a strongly collaborative culture. But such people will not work as exchangeable widgets in school systems that are organized as tailorist workplaces, that rely mainly on bureaucratic command and control systems to direct their work. To attract the people they need, high-performing education systems have transformed the work organization in their schools to one in which professional norms of control replace bureaucratic and administrative forms of management. And in the past, schools were technological islands, with technology often conserving existing educational practice, rather than transforming it. As students were always outpacing schools in their adoption and consumption of technology. You see, the highest performing education systems using the potential of technologies to liberate learning from past conventions and connect learners in new and powerful ways, with sources of knowledge, with innovative applications, and with one another. Let's look at these things in turn. The past has taught us how to educate second-class robots, people who are good at repeating what we tell them. How do we educate learners for their future rather than for our past? How do we educate learners who complement, not substitute, the artificial intelligence we created in our computers? The bottom line is that the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource. PISA provides an interesting angle to this. I just said that money and time are not great predictors of the quality of an education system. But whether students have a growth mindset is. You can see a strong cross-country correlation between learning outcomes and the extent to which students have that growth mindset. It's not so surprising If you believe success in education is just about the talent you're born with, why would you study hard? Look at Estonia, which comes out first on growth mindset and very well on learning outcomes. And Indonesia, which has much room for improvement on both dimensions. You can see also how students with a growth mindset were more likely to persist to finish difficult tasks. They had greater confidence in their abilities. They were less afraid of failure. Think about that. If you want students to be creative, they'll need space to experiment. If they experiment, they will take risks. If they take risks, they'll make mistakes. If schools don't help students learn from and with mistakes through a growth mindset, they may not become so creative. Students with a stronger growth mindset were also more likely to see the value of school for their own future. The relationship between growth mindset and learning outcomes varies also across groups of students. You can see how a growth mindset matters more for girls, for disadvantaged students, and for students with an immigrant background. This is where things get so relevant for education policy and practice. Sometimes we also forget how much school life means for student life. Think about teacher enthusiasm, where students are more likely to agree that the teacher conveys a passion for what they teach. Reading outcomes were better. Also, whether students enjoy reading relates closely to whether they perceive their teachers to be enthusiastic, to engage, to support them, and to provide high-quality instruction. You might argue that this is just a reflection on how well students actually read, but even when you discount that statistically, the pattern remains. And in every country, students reported a more positive disciplinary climate and greater motivation to tackle difficult tasks when they felt their teachers to be more enthusiastic. And it's about more than academic outcomes. PISA also looked at whether students find school a place where they feel they belong, where they find meaning, and where they make friends. And you can see the US has quite a way to go on that too. And the same is true when you look at whether students report being happy with their lives. Now you can say what all that has to do with school policy and practice. Isn't that about families and friends? Sure, but you can see here where disciplinary climate in school is better. Students are happier with their lives. And the same was true where students felt a stronger sense of belonging. And you also see how closely teacher behavior relates to how satisfied students are with their lives. Whether it's the perceived support from teachers or the feedback which students receive. We demand so much from teachers. We expect them to have a deep and broad understanding of what they teach and whom they teach. Because what teachers know and care about makes such a difference to student learning. We also expect them to be passionate, compassionate, thoughtful, to encourage students' engagement and responsibility, to respond to students from different backgrounds with different needs, to provide continual assessment of students, to provide feedback, and to ensure that students feel valued and included. And what learners are most likely going to remember from the pandemic a decade from now is those teachers who took a real interest in their life, in their aspirations, who helped them understand who they are and discover their passions, and who taught them how to love to learn. What I take away from all of this is the importance of rigor, focus, coherence. Rigor is about raising aspirations and cognitive demand. Focus should push us to teach fewer things at greater depths, rather than offering a curriculum that is a mile wide and just an inch deep. Coherence is about designing learning experiences that are aligned with what we know from learning science about how humans learn. Success is also about learning that is problem-based, project-based, co-created, in conversation. And that just underlines the critical role of teachers who have a deep passion for their subject, who understand how different students learn that subject differently, and who really know their students. And let's remember that some of the most important capabilities in life are caught, not taught. Let's move to the second topic. How do we advance from sorting students to leveraging the extraordinary talents of ordinary students? Let me bring you back to the PISA league table. Let's look at the US more closely. Is 10% most disadvantaged students come out towards the bottom of the global scale, while the 10% students from the wealthiest backgrounds deliver world-class results? You might conclude from this that poverty is destiny. But then take similarly disadvantaged students in Portugal, and you can see they do much better than their American counterparts. And you can take students with exactly the same characteristics in the 4 provinces in China, and the 10% most disadvantaged students in those provinces do better than the average American. To achieve that, they attract the strongest principals to the toughest schools, and the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. You know, if you're a vice principal in a high-performing school and you want to become principal, your superintendent in those provinces will tell you, well, that's a great aspiration, but first show us to turn around one of the most disadvantaged schools. And they will give you whatever support and whatever resources you need to make that happen. They also align policies and practices across the entire system. They ensure that they are coherent over sustained periods of time, and that they are consistently implemented with robust accountability systems that encourage improvement and innovation rather than administrative compliance. It's a powerful illustration that poverty need not be destiny. But equity isn't just about social background, it's also about location. You can see here that in Finland, less than 7% of the performance variation among students lies between schools. The closest school is always the best school. Contrast that with Israel, where this choice of schools is hugely influential. And you might be surprised to find the US so far left on this slide. People tend to associate underperformance often with particular schools. But that's missing the point. Underperformance in the US is not just about poor kids from poor neighborhoods, but about many kids in many schools from many neighborhoods. You can see that in the very long gray bar here. And people who link the social disparities in learning outcomes to segregation between publicly and privately managed schools are missing the point too. In fact, just a very small share of the social segregation comes down to that. You can see that here in the tiny blue segment. In the US, most of the social segregation in the PISA results come from within the public school system. I know that's a tough message for public policy, but an important one. All in all, the odds are stacked against the disadvantaged, not just in the US, but in many countries. And how we treat the most vulnerable students and citizens shows who we are as a society. Whether you look at growth mindset, positive feelings, at bullying, but also teacher enthusiasm and discipline, the disadvantaged are doubly disadvantaged by coming from a less privileged background and going to a school with a poorer environment. And we see that mirrored in student aspirations. Take students from disadvantaged backgrounds who have the same PISA scores as their privileged peers. So they have significant academic potential. But the results show that these students are still less likely to expect a university qualification. Maybe because we haven't been good enough to give them hope and to develop a sufficiently ambitious worldview for them. PISA shows the same picture when it comes to occupational aspirations. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to have a very myopic perspective of the world of work. You cannot be what you cannot see. PISA also shows big gender stereotypes. Here you see the boys and girls with the highest math and science scores in PISA. In most countries, the share of high-performing boys who want to become science and engineering professionals is so much larger than the share of girls, despite both groups having the same potential. Education systems have generally done well with moderating gender differences in STEM learning. But when it comes to the social and emotional attachment to STEM careers, we still have a long way to go. But look at the countries in Eastern Europe, which are much further advanced than the rest of the world on this measure. And that's the interesting point of international comparisons. They always show a way out. But some of the answers may require not just changes in behavior, but also in the design of our school systems. In countries on the right side of this chart, you see how disadvantaged students have virtually no chance to make it into a school with high academic performance. But the US does actually quite well on this. The system in the US provides for more social mobility than you might think if people use it. The problem is more that the allocation of resources to schools remains deeply regressive. Disadvantaged schools have fewer material resources and, most importantly, fewer qualified teaching staff. That is the first thing to turn around if we want to ensure that every student benefits from excellent teaching. High-performing education systems have also moved from looking upwards in the bureaucracy towards looking outwards to the next teachers, the next school, and the next education system. In the past, administrations emphasized school management. Now the focus turns to instructional leadership, with school leaders supporting, evaluating, developing high-quality teachers and designing innovative learning environments. Many people consider the US a school system with local control. But it depends from what perspective you look at that. If you look at this through the lens of a school, your relative discretion is actually quite limited in the US. Look at the Netherlands, where schools make over 90% of all decisions. It is public schools who decide who they hire for what, how they allocate their resources, how they tailor their curriculum, and what pedagogical visions they pursue. Parents in the Netherlands can choose the school that they see best fit for their children. But importantly, the government has a strong regulatory framework in place that addresses underperformance and so ensures that parents have only good choices. That's how everybody wins. In the US, just 16% of decisions are actually taken at the front line. Having strong schools doesn't mean that governments are weak. In many countries, governments play an important role to focus resources, reconcile choice with equity, create a facilitative policy climate, and use accountability to encourage new practice rather than just compliance. But it's equally important that education becomes better at identifying key agents of change, champion them, and find more effective approaches to scaling and disseminating innovations. We spend much time pushing ideas into schools, and too little time finding the good ideas in classrooms, and scaling and spreading them. That is also about finding better ways to recognize, to reward, and give exposure to success. To do whatever is possible to make it easier for innovators to take risks and to encourage the emergence of new ideas. You can see that the PISA data show that more discretion at the front line generally relates also positively to better outcomes. Now, all of that is easy to say, hard to do. The road of education reform is littered with many good ideas that were poorly implemented. Changing schools can be like moving graveyards. It's sometimes hard to rely on the people out there to help you because the status quo has so many protectors. And sometimes we as parents are part of the problem, not part of the solution. We get quickly anxious when our children no longer learn what was so important for us, or even more so when they learn things we no longer understand. Everybody supports reform except for their own children. And even those who promote reforms sometimes change their mind when they understand what change actually entails for them. Teachers often teach how they were taught, not how they were taught to teach. And as a policymaker, you can lose an election over education when something goes wrong. But you rarely win an election over education simply because it takes so much time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. We also lack an education industry that pushes innovation and absorbs risks. And educational research, too, is often disengaged from the real needs of real classrooms. And of course, the frogs rarely clear the swamp. The loss of privilege is so pervasive in education because of so many vested interests. And then there is this asymmetry between the costs and the benefits of change. The costs of reform are certain, they're immediate. The benefits are uncertain, they're long-term. Perhaps most importantly, the laws, regulations, structures, institutions on which we tend to focus when reforming education, they are just like this small, visible tip of a huge iceberg. The reason why it's so hard to move education systems forward is that there is a much larger, invisible part under the waterline. This invisible part is about the interests, the beliefs, the motivations, the fears of people, teachers included. That is where the unexpected collisions occur, because that part tends to evade the radar of public policy. Policymakers are rarely successful with education reform unless they help people recognize what needs to change and build a shared understanding and collective ownership for change, unless they focus resources, build capacity, and create the right policy climate with accountability measures designed to encourage innovation rather than compliance. Programs and initiatives rarely scale. It's always culture that scales. And culture is always the hallmark of effective leadership. Culture is about system learning, about system-wide innovation, and about purposeful collaboration. To achieve transformative change, don't ask yourself how many of your staff support your own ideas. Ask yourself, how well can your staff collaborate? Great education leaders are transparent with teachers and school leaders about where reform is heading and what it means for them. They are aware of how organizational policies and practices can either facilitate or inhibit transformation. They tackle institutional structures that are built around the interests and habits of adults rather than learners. They recognize emerging trends and patterns and see how these might benefit or obstruct the goals of change. They use knowledge about what motivates people to convince others to support change. They understand power and influence to build the alliances and coalitions that are needed to get things done. And they help rules to become good practice, and good practice to become culture. And last but not least, education needs not just to look forward, but also look outward. The difference between education systems that are open to the world and ready to learn with others, and those that feel threatened by being exposed to alternative ways of thinking and working. That's likely to be a key differentiator in the educational progress that we're going to see around the world. The world is indifferent to tradition and past reputation, quite unforgiving to frailty and ignorant of custom, of practice. Success will go to those individuals and nations which are swift to adapt, slow to complain, and always open to change. By showing what is possible in the world's leading education systems, I hope I was able to convince you that universal, high-quality education is an attainable goal. That it is within our means to deliver a future for millions of learners who currently don't have one. And that our task is not to make the impossible possible, but to make the possible attainable. Thank you for your attention.